Welcome to Resource Sessions. I'm Gwendolyn Sterk of Sterk Family Law, and today we are going to address a very important topic, which is a new law called Karina's Law and its impact on domestic violence survivors. So I want to welcome two great individuals here. We have Jennifer, who's from ANEW, and we also have Maralea, who is from the network Advocating Against Domestic Violence. So I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to introduce yourselves and your organizations. So Jennifer, why don't we start with you?
Sure, Gwen. Thank you so much for having us on this show. I know you've had ANEW before, and so we appreciate the invitation to come back and talk with you. I'm Jennifer Gabrenya. I'm the CEO with ANEW, Building Beyond Violence and Abuse. We are a domestic violence prevention and services organization that's serving the South Suburban Cook County, and we're located down in Homewood. I have been doing domestic violence work forever, my entire adult life, and actually have been affiliated with the network for 25 years now, which is quite a long time when I looked at it. I'm so happy to be here with Maralea.
And that bridges the gap. So, Maralea, you can tell us a little bit about the network advocating against domestic violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation again. Maralea Negron, she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy, Advocacy and Research at the network Advocating Against Domestic Violence. And we're a collaborative partnership, membership-driven organization of direct service providers throughout Cook and the Collier counties. So all of the members that make up our membership are direct service providers, whether that be domestic violence, sexual assault programming, and some cases human trafficking as well. In some cases, some programs provide all types of services, and so really comprehensive. And then our statewide reach comes from us administering the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline. We release data reports every year, multiple times a year, on kind of the impact of calls to the hotline, requests for services, and services received from programs throughout Illinois.
Very good. A lot of work being done there. So, Jennifer, I really want to start with you today to talk about what dangers survivors face regarding firearms, especially when they're filing for an order of protection. So, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so even the time of filing for an order of protection is a time of increased danger for a survivor. So anytime we see that a survivor is making moves to end a relationship, we see that the risk for lethality or the risk for heightened or further abuse is going to go up. So when there's a firearm involved, then we have two lethality factors that are coming together because the presence, just the mere presence of a fire alarm really increases the risk of further abuse or lethality, we call it, risk of death to a survivor of domestic violence. So when you've got the moment where someone is filing for an order of protection and they know that firearms are involved, that's a really scary time for us.
Yeah, and especially I would think that in the early days, it's even more fearful for them, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about like the really early days when there wasn't quite as much training and
100%.
wasn't quite as much information out there and your interventions were, just take a break from each other for a little while.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
that's quite frightening. And you'll notice when you watch the news and anytime we even see homicides with a firearm, many of us in the domestic violence field do this thing where we sort of wait for the third time that they talk about the story, because oftentimes by then is when you'll hear whether domestic violence was involved in the situation or if the person had a history of domestic violence. So there is a very long, deeply connected past and history of firearm violence and domestic violence.
So then I think I'd ask you, Maralea, what was that legal gaps? Clearly, Karina's law was necessary, but what was missing? What prompted this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, there were a number of really high profile homicides that really were coming up. And it felt like in the community, every day we were seeing a high profile homicide that was happening, whether that be a complete family annihilation case or an injury of a family or an intimate partner. And it just felt like it was increasing. And the data did show that it was increasing because we do a lot of work to monitor firearm involved domestic violence cases in Chicago and throughout Illinois. And we did a whole report on it while we were waiting for the United States court case in Rahimi. And so the data did show that. And what we realized in talking, to service providers and talking to survivors was there was a whole firearm remedy dedicated in orders of protection. It was 14.5. It is still 14.5, but there was a big gap in enforcement of 14.5. And so the way that it was being applied really varied in courthouse and which judge you were in front of. And some judges were issuing search warrants when they were granting that remedy as part of an order of protection. Others were treating it as a surrender order. Some jurisdictions even created their own surrender order paperwork to follow up with the order of protection, so that when law enforcement was serving that order of protection, that respondent would be asked immediately, 14.5 has been granted by the judge, which is a firearm prohibition and surrender. You have to turn over your firearms right now or you'll be in violation of the order of protection. And so we were seeing kind of this gap of enforcement and kind of interpretation of the law. And that's when we started to do some advocacy work to try and address the gap. And so Karina's law is really a comprehensive change to this remedy, because orders of protection are very intentionally meant to be one-stop shop, survivor-centered, not re-traumatizing a survivor so that then they have to go get, separately a firearm restraining order. It really is baking that process into the order of protection as it was intended to have been since from the jump.
And I would agree with you as a practitioner doing and obtaining order protections for various clientele. You're right, depending on the county, the judge, the circumstances, you might have gotten a different answer at different times. So then, Marilee, tell me, how did your organization advocate for the bill and how did it get started from there?
Yeah, so the first version of this bill was actually filed in 2022. And so there had been previous versions of the bill filed, same spirit, but kind of different concepts. And, we started to have early conversations with legislators to try and understand the nuances here, because as I'm sure you know, and Jennifer knows, in every order of protection, automatically a FOID card or CCL is suspended. That's part of the FOID Act. That's part of federal law. And so the gap really here with 14.5 was about enforcement and having teeth to that. And so we just kept coming across really high profile homicide cases, and the community was really devastated writ large, and just this issue of firearms not being addressed, even when all the signs were there. And to the conversation earlier, just the really huge backlog of data and research that we have about the intersection of domestic violence and firearms. I mean, it's truly a no-brainer when folks start to look into it. And so we had introduced a version of Karina's law, but it hadn't yet been named after Karina Gonzalez. And when that homicide happened, I think it almost was like the case that broke the camel's back, right, in terms of the community. And we were like, this has to really stop. I mean, the younger daughter, Daniela, was killed as well, allegedly by the father. The case is still ongoing. The son, Manny, who was really the one who championed this legislation, was also injured. But this really took a village, and it took that family kind of turning their pain and loss into change and advocacy to get this bill across the finish line. And once we kind of redrafted the bill and continued to negotiate with stakeholders, with law enforcement, and we got those survivor voices really front and center about the impact that firearms and domestic violence have, I think that really was what undid kind of the stuck in the mud push that we had around Karina's law. And then the other wrench that was thrown in there was, of course, the Rahimi decision that we were all anxiously waiting at the federal level. And so when that kind of came down on the side of survivors, it was a green light.
Sure. And that really opened that door to go forward with it. Were there any specific challenges you found facing during the advocacy period when you're trying to get the law passed?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of misconceptions around the use of a firearm and kind of the presence of a firearm when you're experiencing domestic violence. And I think a lot of folks thought, well, if the gun hasn't been directly used against you, if you haven't been shot already, if you haven't been, it hasn't been aimed at you, there hasn't been a direct threat, then that shouldn't be considered. And I think, I always point back to we have to believe survivors, and we have to believe that no one knows their situation or the circumstances or even that person, that respondent, for example, in an order of protection better than they do. And so who is more qualified to say what level of danger they are in than that petitioner, that survivor who is seeking this relief? And I think, in doing advocacy, it really was about painting that human picture of when you have especially pro se petitioners who are going in open court and kind of divulging some of the most horrific things that have happened to them. We have to believe survivors, and we have to do a better job as a system, a court system, a law enforcement system, and even as advocates in believing and equipping survivors for this process.
Yeah, and how do you deem it, now that it's been in place and it's a new place, have you seen change, or have you done any data accumulation to see whether or not the court system is actually handling it, and, subsequent agencies that would be involved? Do we see that this is now being used in a good way?
Yeah, I would say anecdotally, we have heard some success stories, specifically in Cook. I think there's been at least one granted in Kane and DuPage counties, respectively. But we do really have our work cut out for us. I think part of the battle is making sure that all jurisdictions are trained and informed in a consistent manner. And we just wrapped up here at the network our first training series to inform legal aid attorneys and legal advocates that are working directly with clients about this huge change in the law and the distinction between, prohibition, surrender, and a search warrant actually being issued as part of an order of protection, and kind of the range of possibilities with the order of protection. But now we really have to start focusing on educating those external stakeholders and partners, making sure that they feel the support from the advocacy community, because we all want this to work, right? And so it's going to take that feedback loop of communicating and cross communicating to make sure that it's working as intended.
No, and I would agree with that, because I think that becomes, at least from my legal perspective, which is a very limited scope compared to the two of you. But from my legal perspective, I think making sure that the judges know, and that you're really, as an attorney, advocating for the different provisions and asking, you make the big ask and you get what you can, but you make sure that you're putting that in the forefront, right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
talking about it. And that's not to be critical of the judiciary in any way, but it's something that has to be done, because, for example, in domestic relations court, you might start in a DV courtroom, but you might end up doing it as part of the divorce process. So having that education in all those communities, I think, is becoming really critical. So for the implementation of this, which is interesting from my perspective. Now, Jennifer, going back to you, we talked about service providers, and Marilee just talked about, really that's another step for that education. So tell me what you've done to implement education, obviously, to your clientele, and what you think needs to be done from that perspective.
Yeah, so our advocates service the Markham Courthouse, which is the 6th municipal circuit in Cook County. And they're in the process, like Maralea described, of getting trained and understanding it. I know that it has made the order of protection longer than it used to be. So there's more paperwork involved, and having to sit down and go through that with people and understand it. But I think the biggest piece is how you were talking about with the partnership and the other parties. So our advocates aren't just working on the order of protection alone. They're working at it with a whole big group of people that have to understand also what's going on. And we tend to see that our advocates are kind of the first ones to understand what's happening, and then everyone else has to catch up to them. So they end up being in the place of working hard to understand what's happening, and the implementation is happening as they're learning, and they end up having to try to help sort of train right on the ground everyone else. So it's a little bit chaotic right now in the very beginning. It just, what are we, just over a month, I think, since the law was enacted. So that's what's going on, and those are the challenges for the service providers on the ground. And all the courtrooms work differently, as you know. Like, what's going on in Markham is very different than what's going to go on in any other courthouse. Yeah.
And so really understanding that, and then also, having that known to also the victims, right? because
Yes.
it's new for them. So how are you approaching the education of Karina's law to understand what the victims may have the ability to do now?
Yeah, so we really rely on the network quite a bit for our training and our education, and then try to translate that down then to the survivors that are coming in the best way that we can. And it's all just about patience. I mean, our advocates are accustomed to having to explain the whole process because most people, when they come into court for an order of protection, really don't have any idea what they're coming in for. They don't know what the paperwork's like. They don't know what the process is like. So they are accustomed to having to sit down and really talk to people, even to having explained to people and find out whether an order of protection is the correct thing for them to get in
Right,
their
right.
situation. So they're very good at that, being able to sit with someone, calm them, get them to the point where they can talk about their story, and then just slowly explaining the process all the way through, asking the questions so they can understand those remedies. You know, the general public has no idea how many remedies are in an order of protection, and it takes having the right kind of conversation with someone to figure out which remedies you're going to request and whether or not that's one of them. I mean, sometimes you can go through and have a conversation, think you're done with the order of protection, and then all of a sudden a firearm comes up because
Right.
if you don't ask the question in the right way, they just might not think to tell you.
Right. And I also want to talk about the other side. And I know that you are working on the advocacy side for the victims, but as a practitioner, I'm also representing people who have an order of protection against them. And I think the other side of the coin is explaining to them what the order means and what they have to do to comply with the order. So there's that side of the coin too, because there are steps that need to be taken or, to cooperate to get this done to make it work. So I don't want to leave that piece out. I think that it's kind of, we get
Yeah.
focused on it, but we have to look at it. And we recently had one, and I thought, well, that was the first thing that came from my mind is, well, now we got to look at the other side of the coin here to also prepare people for what that looks like, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we run a partner abuse intervention program as
You do, yeah,
part of our mix of services in the
right.
organization. So you're absolutely right. We have to know on the one side, but then, we may have people, in one of our PAPE groups that have an order against them, and they're going through certain steps to complete their court mandated, partner abuse intervention program. And they have to stay in line,
They
with
do.
this order
Yeah, you're
also.
completely right. So I think that that education piece is an important element as well. Back to you, Marilee. Tell us, we've talked about a couple ways, the education, making sure that, when you're representing somebody that you understand what the remedies look like, making sure that it's done. And then if you're on the flip side, making sure that there's compliance. How else can attorneys and advocates support enforcement of this law that I think I don't know if you used the word no brainer, but it was kind of like, yeah, we need this. So how can we
Yeah,
help?
absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. Because it really did take a village to get this passed and a huge coalition of partners to support this initiative. Even though it was a no-brainer, it was involving firearms, which we know is always going to be a challenging topic, no matter where you stand on the issue. And so I think that the best way that attorneys and advocates can support enforcement is really providing that feedback loop. And everywhere that I go and I talk about Karina's law, I'm like, here's my email, here's my phone number. Please call us. We want to hear how it's going. Because the network did lead the passage of Karina's law, we really want to make sure it works as intended. And so we can't do that without the feedback of how is it going in your jurisdiction, because we can do everything possible to train and communicate with all of the systems players in Cook or in the collar counties. But when it comes to other jurisdictions, it can be a little bit more challenging, which is where we rely on folks to kind of let us know how it's going and where we can be supportive. And something that I've talked a lot about as part of our training series is, we would eventually like to do a training series that is specifically just for stakeholders of how different jurisdictions might be able to implement Karina's law and cross communicate with each other to make sure where we are in the process, especially in those limited cases where search warrants may be issued. And so learning from each other, learning from jurisdictions of what has worked and what hasn't worked, what technology is available, and kind of where folks are located are all factors that we're considering. But I'd say sharing any information of how your case has worked or hasn't worked as it relates to this change in the law would be really helpful.
Now, do you find that law enforcement and the courts are ready to implement this and ready to act on it?
Yeah, the conversations with law enforcement and courts are still ongoing. As I said, I think the bulk of our work here has been in Cook because it's such a large jurisdiction, is making sure that in all of the courthouses throughout Cook, the judges are equipped with this change in the law. And so been having a lot of conversations with different divisions and different presiding judges to talk about this change and how we can be supportive of their divisions and implementing. And with law enforcement, a lot of the same actors of who we negotiated the legislation with, we've been in communication with them about how we can support implementation and what they've been saying in their respective jurisdictions. So I do think that there's still some work cut out. We know that a number of jurisdictions have not fully implemented. We know that a lot of survivors don't know about this change in the law as well, right? There aren't, unfortunately, legal advocates or legal aid attorneys available in every single jurisdiction throughout this state and every courthouse kind of co-located. And that's a big gap as well in knowledge and opportunity there. But we're hopeful that in jurisdictions where we do have the programs, the legal aid attorneys to support, that education and those resources can be there to make sure that this is successfully done.
No, and I think that's wonderful. And I just want to make an observation, and I think it's true of any law, whether we have a change in, we do family law, whether we have a change in the Illinois Marriage and Dissolution of Marriage Act, whether we're under the DV code, the Domestic Violence Act, whatever it is, it's one thing to pass the law, it's another thing to watch it unfold, right?
Right.
So it is that education, it is that time period. And unfortunately, sometimes one or two cases become the example to everybody else. But getting that word out is really critical to make it work and to make sure that everybody's on the same page of what the remedies are. You can't control the outcome, but by educating and have that knowledge, then you can make sure that you've got that implemented across the board, which is a really good point. Thank you for that. Now, going back to you, Jennifer, what should a survivor who might be listening to this and saying, first of all, I didn't know about Karina's law. Obviously, it is a victim who was murdered and had the child, and the son went out to try to really get this done, who was hurt and his own victim in a lot of ways. But
Yeah.
what is the call really out there for that survivor who's listening to this podcast and maybe on a walk and not even started the process yet? Where do we go with that?
Yeah, so the call is really, for people who are listening to this or anything else about domestic violence, and they've got those thoughts kind of swirling in their heads of like, does this mean me? Does this fit me? It You really just need to make the call, whether you share at the end, whether it's the Illinois State Hotline, whether it's a news hotline, but really to reach out someone and just start asking those questions. Even if you're not sure, most people don't like to call what they're going through abuse. Most of the people that I've come in contact are not going to say I'm a victim of domestic violence, don't necessarily say I'm being abused, but they'll say things like, I'm kind of afraid of my partner, or this crazy thing happened the other night. They'll explain it in different ways. Or yeah, my partner has a gun and I really am worried about it sometimes. It's really making a call and just asking that question. I mean, I remember I even had a cousin that I was talking to once, and I can't remember where the conversation came to, but we were talking about money. And then something just dawned on her, and she was like, I didn't even know that that was a thing that could be abuse. And I was like, well, just here's a hotline number. Just, it doesn't mean anything. You don't have to do anything when you make a phone call, but just go ahead and make a phone call and ask. Just talk about what's going on and see what the other people say to you. It's just kind of opening that door a little bit and getting a little bit more information to help you decide what the next step is going to be. The decision is yours, but the more information you have, the more prepared you are to say, okay, do I want to take the next step and the next step? Because it's a process.
Sure. Now, we have that audience that's listening and they do need to take that first step. I always talk about it as paralysis, right? We don't want to take that. You don't have, and you made a very good point, and I appreciate that. Just by calling, you're asking questions, and knowledge is power. It doesn't mean you have to do something. It's starting
Right.
the process out. So I think
Right.
that's really important. But I think we also have an audience today who is saying, okay, I've heard about this. I wanted to learn a little more about it. How can people help, in your opinion, through advocacy, volunteering, sharing resources? Give us an idea. What can somebody do who is passionate about this, but may not be a victim or may know a friend, right, who's going through this?
Yeah, so for friends, I always say to keep your local domestic violence agency hotline near and dear to you. You know, put it in your phone, put it in your pocket, grab a couple of cards because you do never know when it's going to come up. And especially if you talk about it, or if you're one of those people who will share things on social media, the people in your network will start to notice that you're sharing those things on social media, and you will start to get, I can't even tell you how many messages I've gotten in my inbox, completely not work related at all, where people are telling me about a family member or a friend. So I even have, so I actually don't live in the community where I work. So I have the hotline number of the DV agency of the community where I do live, like
Yeah,
up on my refrigerator, so that if anybody asks me, I can say this is the closest place to you.
sure.
And then if you want to do more, again, it's contacting that place yourself and say, hey, I want to learn more. I want to volunteer. Many of us have a variety of trainings where you can sort of get like a 101 introduction to training, all the way through getting the state required 40-hour
Right.
domestic violence training, which really prepares you to do much more in-depth advocacy and support.
Right. And I'm sure there's other ways, events that you can participate in,
Oh, yeah.
funding issues. There's a lot of different ways. So I urge the listener
Yeah.
to go to the websites of these
Yes.
organizations and find out, because I know you have an event coming up. You've had one just this last weekend,
Yes.
and there's a
Yep.
lot of
Yeah.
opportunity out there for people,
Oh,
that.
there's a lot. If they could sign up for a newsletter, I mean, one of the great things, if you sign up for the newsletter with the network, they're wonderful and timely in sending out the action alerts, which will let you know when you can do a witness slip, which is a really easy and empowering way to get involved in advocacy. It takes literally 1 minute to go online and to do a witness slip, and your voice really is heard. We hear over and over again about how the numbers of people who fill out those witness slips are noticed and can help move things along. So I know that people are always in various stages of what they think advocacy or activism is, but there's definitely something there for everyone. And when it comes down to it, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is be there and listen to someone.
Sure. No, that's very true. And I think that there's a lot of people who want to give more support. Maybe they don't want to label it or whatever, but there are opportunities, and that's what I'd like to share on this. Marilee, do you see anything else that you think that somebody could do?
Yeah, I would say just be informed of kind of what's moving legislatively, at least from a policy perspective of what the conversations are, and advocate. If you're passionate about this issue, have conversations with individuals in positions of power, whether that be a city council person, a judge that you may know, a legislator. I think it's really important to start to speak about domestic violence and gender-based violence writ large on a more common scale. I think for a long time, this topic has been kind of taboo, and it's been something that folks have been, scared to talk about. But I think that it really is an issue that we need to be speaking out about publicly. And even if you're not comfortable disclosing, your lived experience, but I think identifying it as a key issue area where you are looking for those individuals in positions of power to prioritize, I think is always really impactful, and it's not talked about enough.
Now, I have another question for you. Now that Karina's law is there, and obviously you're in the second part of it, right? Going to the next steps to say, all right, now we need to implement that law. Are there other legislative plans that you and the network have to kind of build from here as well?
Yeah, I think for Karina's law specifically, it's really about making sure that implementation is where it needs to be. So I think right now it's really about doing the legwork to do the education, the outreach, come up with the resources, and monitor how it's going. And then from lessons learned there, seeing if there's anything we need to tweak and fine tune in the law. So I definitely think a trailer bill is not off the table. It is something that we are having conversations about, and it's very much on our radar. I think it's more more about making sure that we have enough information and enough case examples to really paint a broader picture of what's happening throughout the state. And so again, I would encourage any listeners, if they have cases that come up, case examples, whatever the outcome may be, we'd love to hear the feedback.
And if you're listening, a trailer bill is really one that expands on it, makes corrections, or fills in a gap of something that was missing the first time through. And because you know what, life is, we can't anticipate everything. And so finally, you have to have a bill to introduce. It gets passed, and that's what the trailer process is about. So I really think that's a good point to bring out, that there's always going to be changes. Nothing is perfect from the beginning, but I hear the passion in both your voices that at the end of the day, this is really about the victims and making sure that they can survive and move forward with their life in a positive way. So I really appreciate that. Maralea, tell us about the network. Do you have events, ways that people can become involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have volunteer sign up opportunities, and we also do have a sponsorship run that we do. We do our Run Domestic Violence out, and it's through the Chicago Marathon that happens. So we fundraise for that as well. So we'd encourage you to visit our website and check out our opportunities to get involved. But if you know a survivor, are a survivor, and you're looking to get involved in policy advocacy initiatives, I would also encourage you to reach out to myself and my team. I think especially in the context of Karina's Law, when there started to be more media around it, we had a number of survivors reach out and were like, hey, I want to get involved in supporting this. How can I get involved? And no action is ever too small. So I would just encourage folks again to become advocates in this space.
No, I think it's a wonderful opportunity. And I encourage anybody, either one of these organizations, start there, pick up the phone, ask that first question. And if you want to help, ask the first question of how do I get started? We all have talents. Some of us have more time, some of us have more money, some of us have different skills. We all come, that's what makes the community work. And you talked about it takes a village. And this implementation to address these things is going to take a village. It takes all of us learning how to work together. And I know from a legal perspective, we appreciate that there is a whole network out there that we know there can be supportive means for the victim going through, or alternatively for the person who engaged in the abuse, because certainly there's two sides to that coin. And I urge the listeners to make sure that you're hearing us, that everybody has an opportunity to get help and to address these concerns. So I'm Gwendolyn Sterk. I have been honored and privileged to have both Jennifer of ANEW and Maralea of the network advocating against domestic violence with us today. Thank you so much for your time. We truly appreciate it, and we truly appreciate and would invite you back in 6 months or a year to see how this implementation is going, so that we can talk and keep the premise alive so that people are really utilizing this law. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.